Namaskar, and welcome to another episode of Ananda Marga Dharmacast. This is a podcast series looking at topics in spirituality using the teachings and writings of Shrii Shrii Anandamurti as our starting point. So today we're going to discuss what is absolute truth, or Satya, which is the Sanskrit term that is used here. And we're going to be basing our discussion on a discourse which Anandamurti gave back in 1978, which is called The Supreme Abode of Satya. And in it he talks about many important things. Now before I start, let me say that if you ever go to India and you go out in the street and you start to ask some people, what is Satya? They will know something. They will say, oh, it means to tell the truth, be truthful. So Satya has something to do with truth, but, like when you say, I did this or I didn't do that, if it's true or not, but it means a lot more than that. And we're going to go into some of those aspects of it today, but we will maybe not be able to cover them all. So it's a vast topic. And in fact, Satya doesn't even really have an English equivalent, really. So here he starts off with a poem from the Vedas, a shloka, as he often does, and then comments on them. So I'll read it in my not so great Sanskrit accent, but I'll do my best. Ananda Dieva Kalvi Mani Bhutani Jayanti Anandena Jatani Jivanti Anandam Pratya Abhisham Visantiti. So what does that mean? So he said, everything, micros or macros, whatever is caused or creative, cometh from the composure of bliss. And Anandena Jatani Jivanti, that is, because of the presence of this infinite composure of bliss, each and every entity want to remain in this world. This is the only reason for one's longing for more and more life. And Anandam Pratya Abhisham Vishanti, that is finally, each and every entity goes back to that composure of bliss, to that blissful stance. So this composure of bliss is the only Satya in this universe. So this is really it's a bombshell of a statement, because he's talking about the whole nature of the universe. What is the essence, the absolute essence of the universe? So you know that there are some philosophies that are quite negative. The complete materialists will say, oh, there's nothing here. You live and you die, and you better eat and drink, be merry. That's it. So that's not very reassuring. And then even some normally spiritual philosophers like Buddhism say, oh, this world is suffering, we have to get out of it. But here the yogis say, the Vedic yogis said that this world comes from bliss. It comes from the composure of bliss. That's where it comes from. And the living beings want to remain, that's why we live in this world. When a living being comes into the world, they have a feeling, I've come into this world. So living beings want to be in this bliss. And finally, every entity goes back to that composure of bliss, the blissful stance. So this is the only Satya in this universe. So it is very, very extremely important. Next, he goes on to explain really, so like I said, there's no English equivalent of Satya, but here he explains it a little bit more. He says, and what is Satya? Sat. That is the non-metamorphic entity which it is finally established when it attains in the final rank of non-metamorphosis is called Satya. So Sat means the entity which never changes. And then finally we can call it Satya. So one must move along the path of Satya, and one must have the Satya as one's only desideratum, that means goal. This is the only path. This is the path of fearlessness. That is, there's no fear in it, nothing to be afraid of. So, you think of things which are in this world, and most of the things in this world undergo change, everything. For instance, if I were to ask you, Zagreb is a city in Europe. Can you tell me in what country it lies? So you will, if you live in Europe, or you'll say Croatia. If you don't know, you will Google it. You find, oh, it's Croatia. But that's the answer that's correct today. If you did that question back in 1990, and you say, where is Croatia? You would say it's in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore as a nation state. And now you'll say it's in the eastern hemisphere or west of the earth. But, in millions and billions of years from now, who knows if there will be. In the past, there were different alignments of our continents on this planet. Maybe the planet won't even exist when the sun undergoes some of its changes, which is projected for the future. So all the things that we have in this world are not sat. They're changing. They undergo change. So they're not satya. Now, the second point here that he alludes to, and I'll have to explore that. He says that this is a path of fearlessness. So if you're on this path and your goal is that supreme stance, it means God. Really, that's really what it is. Because the only thing that doesn't undergo change is God. That's what Sat is referring to. So he says, he goes on with another poem here. This one is labeled, it's from the Yajurveda. So he says, they said, Satyameva jayati non-ritam Sachena panta vitato devyana jena kramantyarasyo hyaptakama chatra tat satyasya paramam nidanam. So what does that mean? It means that finally Satya becomes victorious at each and every fight, and each and every clash, and each and every work. Satya comes out successful. Satyameva jayati nanritam. That is, falsehood won't be victorious. So your path to Godhood becomes widened with the help of the Satya. That is, the Satya makes the path wide so that progress towards Godhood is achieved. This is a very important point. So sometimes we see in this world there's a fight going on. But when the struggle is going on and something is based on falsehood, it can't exist. Like, you've heard the fable of the emperor's new clothes. So they told this story, these weavers tricked some people, they tricked the emperor, and that he had invisible clothing, but basically he had no clothing. But they tried to keep this, make everyone around him believe it, so the emperor believed it. But then finally, that lie couldn't exist when it was taken out into a wider public. People started laughing. So that's the way it goes. When something is based on falsehood, it can remain maybe temporarily victorious, it works, but eventually it will be defeated. Then he goes on to explain that Aptavakya is the word of God, and Praptavakya are the words of the worldly authorities. So a person whose all desires have been fully quenched due to coming in proximity to the Supreme Entity is called Hyaptakama. These Hyaptakama rishis or sages moved along this path of Satya in the past and finally come in contact with the supreme abode of Satya. That is, they reached a place which is a final abode. So the Rishis said, then they said, they said that this Satya Swarupa, supreme entity, or that composure of bliss, now they describe what its characteristics are. And they said that it's very big, very, very big. So big that your ocular capacity cannot come in contact with him. And your ocular capacity is limited from a particular wavelength to another particular wavelength, but he is bigger. Then he goes on to explain that this entity is also very small. You can't also measure it. It's very subtle. You can't perceive it. And then he says something very important, that a lot of it depends on what you're thinking. So if you think that this supreme entity is far away, then he's very far. But if you think that he's close and close to you, he's very close. So those who have developed, then he goes on to say, those who have developed the individual vision will realize that God, Paramapurusha, is within oneself. When he is within your own eye feeling, then why do you wander or roam here and there to know him? Like a king who has all the riches with him, but he goes out begging from door to door. So then he finishes, he says, seek him with the earnest zeal, with sincerity and love. Then that glittering entity will emerge within your heart with its supreme effulgence. So here he said a few important things. First of all, that Satya, it comes from a state of composure. This is really the beginning point. And it's for human life, any individual, any life, we merge in that too. It's the composure. Then he said that Satya is an entity that doesn't change. It's the real, the basis of truth. And in our temporal world, if there is indeed a fight of truth against falsehood, eventually the truth will prevail. And that's why he said you shouldn't be afraid. It comes out victorious in each and every fight. Then he talks about different kinds, as I alluded to before, that worldly books have their limitations. They're based on relative facts which may or may not change. But the yogis in the past who moved along the path of spirituality, they will reach the place where this final abode of Satya. And where is that final abode? The final abode of Satya is within of us. This, as I said this many, many times, within each of us is the supreme being. God is within each of us. We say, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, we say, I exist, but we say, I know I exist. I know I exist. So this I know I exist is where that I comes from. That's the soul. We have to reach that. And so that's what the goal is. But if you think that it's very far, you'll be far. And then he said something really important. He says, so why do you go out begging in the world? Beggars is needy, hungry, waiting. Oh, please help me. When within each of us, so much wealth is there. We have to realize that. So this is the supreme abode of Satya, of this unchanging truth, this final truth, and the supreme bliss is within each of us. And we should really live up to our birthright, our capacity, and make active efforts to realize that. So that's why he said, if you think it's far away, it's going to be very far. But if you can start to cultivate your spiritual strength, your spiritual practice, then you will realize that Supreme One is within you and very close, and that there is nothing to be afraid of. So I think I'll leave it at here, but we'll talk more about Satya in a future podcast. And speaking of the podcasts, they're available here on YouTube. And if you want the audio version only, then you go to your podcast platform and you look up Ananda Marga Dharmacast. It's on all the main places now that where podcasts can be availed. Or you can go to our dedicated website, dharmacast.com, and see all the past episodes there. So whether you watch it on YouTube or listen to it, please do so. And subscribe wherever you are. On YouTube, subscribe. And on the podcast platforms, subscribe. And if you give it a thumbs up if you can, or a positive rating, that will help more people to see it. And if you have any questions or queries, and get in touch with me, Dada Veda. You can find me, look me up, and I'll be happy to answer those things for you. And maybe we'll even do a program based on your query. So that's all I want to say for today, and I thank you for listening. And if you're on YouTube, thank you for watching. So take care. And as the yogis say, namaskar, salutations to the divinity within you.